Imagine a world built on power, privilege, and the chilling commerce of human life. A world where bloodlines were everything, and the failure of one meant the shattering of a dynasty. This is the story of Thomas Bowmont Callahan, a man born into wealth, yet condemned by his own fragile form. A story where the deepest horrors were not whispered in shadows, but declared in the gilded halls of Southern aristocracy. The chill of January 1840 was more than just a seasonal change. It was a shadow that loomed over my very entry into this world. While my father, Judge William Callahan, entertained the elite of Mississippi with fine wine and laughter, a different struggle was unfolding in a darkened room upstairs. My mother, Sarah, was caught in the throes of a labor that came 2 months too early, a violent interruption to a life of carefully curated grace. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of rain and the heavy silence of an impending tragedy that no one wanted to name. Outside, the coldest winter in decades gripped the earth in a frozen fist, mirroring the icy fear that took hold of my family. The midwife, Mama Ruth, was a woman whose hands had ushered hundreds of lives into the light, yet even she faltered when she saw me. I was a tiny, bluish thing, more a whisper of a human than a child, shivering against the harsh reality of a drafty plantation bedroom. She looked at my father, a man used to ruling over men, and told him plainly that I would not survive the night. To her, I was a flickering candle in a hurricane, a fragile being whose breathing was too shallow to sustain the weight of a name. She advised him to prepare my mother for the inevitable loss, treating my death as a foregone conclusion before I had even lived. However, my mother possessed a quiet, fierce defiance that even the shadow of death could not dampen or overcome. Despite being delirious with a soaring fever and the sheer exhaustion of her ordeal, she reached out for the bundle that was my body. She pulled me close to her chest, skin against skin, as if her own warmth could jumpstart the failing machinery of my lungs. She whispered to the empty air that I would live, her voice a fragile but unbreakable tether holding me to this world. I can feel his heart. She insisted to the room of doubters, "It is weak, but it is fighting for every single beat." That night became a battleground, where the only weapons were a mother's hope and a premature infant's stubborn, instinctive will to exist. Against every medical certainty of the time, the sun rose to find me still breathing, though each inhale was a ragged victory. I survived the first night, then the next, and eventually the week, defying Mama Ruth's grim prophecy with every passing hour. My father viewed this survival not with joy, but with a growing sense of uneasy confusion, as if I were a legal puzzle he couldn't solve. I was alive, yes, but the cost of that survival was etched into my very frame, a debt I would pay forever. But surviving is a far cry from thriving, a lesson I learned through every missed milestone and every pitying glance from the household staff. While other infants grew plump and sturdy, I remained a skeletal reminder of that frozen January night, haunted by the cold that had seeped into my bones. My body was a collection of failures, a map of development that had been permanently rerouted by my hurried arrival. I was the judge's son, the heir to a massive cotton empire, yet I was smaller than the children in the quarters. From the very beginning, I was a disappointment in a world that valued nothing more than strength, legacy, and power. At 1 month old, I weighed barely 6 pounds, a hauntingly light burden for a mother who carried the weight of the world in her eyes. While other infants began to fill out with the vitality of health, I remained a pale, spindly creature that seemed to shrink away from the light. My physical existence was a series of missed markers, a slow-motion collapse of the expectations placed upon a planter's firstborn son. By 6 months, when the strength of the neck should hold the head high, I remained limp and fragile as a wilted flower. Every day was a testament to the frailty that had been woven into my DNA during that bitter, premature winter of my birth. My father's frustration grew in silence, watching a legacy he had built with iron will struggle to simply sit upright. The physicians arrived like a funeral procession, coming from the bustling docks of Natchez and the sun-drenched streets of far-off New Orleans. They brought with them leather bags filled with cold steel instruments and a clinical detachment that chilled the air more than the winter ever could. Each man performed the same rhythmic dance of tapping on my hollow chest and measuring the stunted growth of my narrow, bird-like limbs. Their voices were low murmurs of stunted development and permanent constitutional weakness, words that felt like nails being driven into the coffin of my future. They offered no cures, only the grim certainty that the hurried nature of my birth had left me forever unfinished in their eyes. To them, I was a biological anomaly, a broken piece of machinery that could never be truly repaired by any earthly science. The year 1846 brought with it a heat so oppressive it seemed to rot the very air, carrying the invisible, saffron scourge of yellow fever. I was only 6 years old when the epidemic swept through the high bluffs of Mississippi, turning our grand mansion into a house of mourning. My mother, the only shield I had against the world's coldness, was the one the fever claimed with a sudden and terrifying cruelty. I remember the smell of vinegar and the sight of black veils draped over the mirrors as the household prepared for the inevitable end. Her skin, once vibrant and warm, turned the color of old, brittle parchment, and her eyes took on a distant, jaundiced yellow hue. Death did not come for the weak son. Instead, it stole the woman who had fought so hard to keep him alive. The day before she departed this life, she called me to her bedside with a voice that sounded like dry leaves skittering across a floor. I knelt by the heavy mahogany bed, feeling the heat radiating from her dying body while she struggled to focus her fading gaze on me. She spoke of the challenges I would face, warned me of the pity that would mask itself as kindness and the dismissive sneers of men. "People will see only the shell," she whispered, her grip surprisingly tight for someone so close to the threshold of the great beyond. She told me that while my body was a betrayal, my mind and soul were weapons that no physical strength could ever hope to match. Her final plea was that I never allow the world to make me feel less than a whole man despite my many limitations. When she died the next morning, the silence that filled the great house was more deafening than the loudest scream I had ever heard. I stood by the window, watching the mourning carriage pull away, and felt the sudden, terrifying weight of my father's solitary and judgmental gaze. Without her presence, I was no longer a miracle of survival to be cherished, but a mounting liability in a society built on power. I didn't fully understand her words then, but they settled into the marrow of my bones like a secret, hidden map for the future. The world of the Callahan Plantation was a place of iron and cotton, and I was a boy made of glass and ancient, forbidden dreams. My mother's death ended my childhood and began the long, slow realization that I was utterly alone in a world that hated weakness. My father, Judge William Callahan, stood as a monumental figure of authority, a man whose very physical presence seemed to demand the obedience of the world around him. At 6 feet tall with shoulders as broad as an ox, his voice possessed a resonant power that could bring the most chaotic courtroom to a sudden, terrifying silence. He was a self-made titan who had carved an empire out of the Mississippi wilderness, rising from a lowly lawyer to the master of an 8,000-acre kingdom. Every inch of his vast cotton estate was a testament to his shrewdness and his relentless, unyielding drive to conquer the land and its people. To him, the world was a ledger of assets and liabilities, and success was measured solely by the expansion of his wealth and his bloodline. I was the only variable in his life that he could not control, a biological failure that stood in stark contrast to his overwhelming strength. The mansion itself was a Greek Revival masterpiece, a fortress of white, painted brick and massive Doric columns that rose like ivory towers above the muddy river bluffs. Inside, the air was cooled by high ceilings and the gentle sway of crystal chandeliers that threw fractured light across floors of polished heart pine. Imported furniture and vast Persian rugs filled rooms designed to host the most powerful men in the South, creating an atmosphere of refined, deceptive elegance. Beyond the grand galleries lay the engine of his wealth, the blacksmith shops, the smokehouses, and the sprawling fields of white gold that stretched toward the horizon. Yet, this beauty was a thin veil over a system of extreme brutality, where 300 human beings were held in the tight grip of iron-fisted labor. I grew up in the quiet luxury of the library, sheltered from the sun, while the true cost of my comfort was paid in the sweat of others. My education was a solitary pursuit, guided by a string of tutors who navigated the labyrinth of my father's massive library alongside my hungry, curious mind. Because I was too frail for the rough play of school, and too sickly to survive the rigors of a boarding academy, I found my brothers in books. I mastered the complexities of Greek and Latin, finding a strange kinship with the ancient philosophers who spoke of the triumph of the soul over the body. Mathematics and literature became my refuge, offering a world of logic and beauty that my own physical form could never hope to replicate or achieve. While other planter sons practiced their marksmanship and horsemanship, I sharpened my intellect in the cooling shadows of the mahogany bookshelves and dusty globes. I became a scholar of a world I was forbidden to physically inhabit, building a fortress of knowledge to hide my growing sense of inadequacy. By the time I reached my 19th year, the full extent of my physical limitations had become an undeniable and permanent reality for all to see. I stood only 5 feet 2 inches tall, possessing the slight, delicate frame of a young boy rather than the robust stature of a Southern gentleman. My bones were so thin and brittle that the family physician once remarked, with clinical coldness, that I possessed the fragile skeleton of a common bird. My chest caved inward, a hollow shadow between my ribs that the doctors called pectus excavatum, making every deep breath feel like a labored and difficult chore. My hands were cursed with a perpetual, fine tremor that made the simplest tasks, like writing a letter or holding a teacup, an exercise in intense concentration. I was a man of glass in a world of iron, a translucent creature whose very veins could be traced beneath skin that had never known the sun. The most devastating blow, however, was the medical confirmation of what my father had long suspected with a growing, silent sense of dread and resentment. My voice had never deepened into the bass of manhood, and my body remained as smooth and hairless as that of a young child entering its first youth. After a series of humiliating examinations, the doctors delivered a verdict that felt more like a legal sentence of execution for our family name. They discovered that my reproductive organs were severely underdeveloped and entirely non-functional, rendering me utterly sterile and incapable of siring an heir to the estate. I was a dead branch on the Callahan tree, a biological end point for a fortune that was intended to last for countless generations to come. In the eyes of my father and the society he ruled, I was no longer a person. I was a failed investment that had yielded no return. The medical examinations began shortly after my 18th birthday. a cold initiation into a world that viewed my body as a public problem to be solved. My father, desperate to secure the Callahan legacy, arranged a meeting with Martha Henderson, hoping that wealth might blind her to my obvious physical shortcomings. The encounter was a jagged humiliation. She looked through me as if I were a ghost and departed within 15 minutes, claiming a sudden headache. I stood frozen in the hallway as she told her mother she could never marry a child who looked as though he might break in half. It was the first time I truly understood that my life was not a tragedy to be pitied, but a spectacle to be loathed. My father's response was not comfort, but a summons for the most prominent and clinical physicians in the state to map my failures. Dr. Samuel Harrison arrived from Natchez with a bag of cold instruments and a detached, analytical gaze that stripped away what little dignity I had left. He forced me to undress completely in my father's study, measuring every inch of my slight frame with the precision of a carpenter assessing rotten wood. His hands were indifferent as he manipulated my underdeveloped form, muttering observations into a leather journal that would become my permanent record of inadequacy. He used terms like hypogonadism and testicular insufficiency, language that transformed my very existence into a series of clinical errors. When he finished, he told my father with brutal honesty that the likelihood of me producing viable seed was virtually non-existent. The word, impossible, hung in the air like a thick, suffocating fog, sealing my fate before I had even begun to live. My father, unwilling to accept a single defeat, brought in 2 more experts to confirm the death of his hopes for a traditional bloodline. Dr. Blackwood from Vicksburg was aggressive and rough, his examination feeling more like an interrogation of my flesh than a medical assessment of health. Then came Dr. Miria, a gentle Creole from New Orleans whose kindness felt worse than the other's cruelty because it was rooted in deep, mournful pity. Each man reached the same conclusion. My development was arrested, my condition was permanent, and my infertility was an absolute certainty. By March 1859, the verdict was unanimous and public, turning me into a pariah within the gossiping circles of the Mississippi planter elite. I was no longer a young man with a future. I was a biological dead end, a defective product in a market of power. The social rejection that followed was a slow, agonizing flaying of my character by people who had once smiled in my father's presence. I overheard whispers in the church pews and at dinner parties where men, fueled by whiskey, spoke of me as if I were a failed breed of livestock. They spoke of nature's way and how the weak were never intended to reproduce, lest they pollute the strength of the collective stock. Families who had once angled for a connection to the Callahan fortune now found polite, transparent reasons to keep their daughters far away from me. I became a cautionary tale, a living example of how even the greatest wealth cannot purchase a functioning body or a guaranteed heir. Every sneer and every averted glance felt like a fresh wound, driving me deeper into the lonely, silent corridors of my own mind. In my isolation, I turned to the forbidden shelves of the library, discovering voices that spoke a truth more dangerous than my father's legal volumes. I found the narratives of Frederick Douglass and the stirring, heart-wrenching prose of Harriet Beecher Stowe, books that were illegal to possess in our state. These authors described a system of brutality that mirrored the cold, transactional way my own father viewed my breeding potential. I saw for the first time the invisible scars on the backs of the men in the fields and the hollow eyes of women whose children were stolen. I realized that my own sense of being merchandise was only a fraction of the horror experienced daily by the people in the quarters. While my father mourned his lost lineage, I began to mourn the very foundation of the world that had given me such hollow comfort. By March 1859, the heavy silence of the Callahan mansion finally shattered under the weight of my father's desperate and dark machinations. He burst into the library, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon and a bitter, lingering resentment that had been festering for months. He spoke of his impending death and the terrifying prospect of his empire falling into the hands of an incompetent, drunken cousin. To him, the land was a living creature that required a master, and he was willing to sacrifice every moral law to ensure its survival. He paced the floor like a caged predator, his eyes reflecting a man who had finally abandoned the pretenses of civilization. The creative solution he proposed was not born of love for me, but of a cold, obsessive need to preserve his power. "I am giving you to Delilah," he declared, his voice dropping into the flat, terrifying tone he used when sentencing men from his judicial bench. He intended to use her body as a vessel, a biological bridge to bypass my own physical failures and secure a future for his name. He planned to breed her with a strong male from a neighboring estate, then manipulate the law to adopt the resulting children as my heirs. To my father, people were merely assets to be shifted across a ledger, and Delilah was the most valuable piece of property he owned. He saw no horror in his plan, only a pragmatic strategy to ensure that the Callahan bloodline, even if diluted and fabricated, would continue to reign. It was a proposal that treated human beings with less dignity than the livestock he traded at the local county fair. Something inside me, long suppressed by years of quiet dependency and physical frailty, snapped with the force of a dry branch in a storm. I had spent my life apologizing for my existence, but I could not and would not be a silent partner in this ultimate, unforgivable crime. I stood up, my hands shaking with a fury that finally outweighed my fear of his formidable, towering presence and his booming voice. "No," I told him, the word feeling like a physical object I was placing between us to halt his descent into total madness. I realized then that my father's strength was merely a mask for a soul that had been rotted away by the absolute power of ownership. I rejected his scheme not just for Delilah's sake, but to salvage the small shred of humanity I still possessed in that house. His rage was a physical thing, a storm of shattered glass and shouted insults that accused me of being an ungrateful, sentimental fool. He blamed me for the social embarrassment of my condition and the failure of his grandest investments, his face reddening with a truly murderous intent. I retreated to my room, the walls of the mansion now feeling like the cold, stone sides of a tomb I was forced to inhabit. I lay awake, haunted by the image of Delilah, a woman who worked like a machine in the sun, but carried a hidden, fierce intelligence. I knew she was nearly 6 feet tall, a pillar of mahogany strength who had endured more in one day than I had in my entire 19 years. I could not let her be turned into a breeder for a family that viewed her as nothing more than a beast of burden. The next morning, driven by a desperate and uncharacteristic courage, I made my way toward the slave quarters to face the reality of my father's plan. I walked the dirt path lined with ancient, moss-draped oaks, feeling like a stranger in a land my family claimed to own, but never understood. The small, cramped cabin stood in a row, a stark and painful contrast to the Doric columns and crystal chandeliers of the main house. I waited until sunset, watching the line of exhausted workers return from the fields, their bodies bent under the weight of the day's labor. When Delilah finally appeared, her stature dwarfing the men around her, I stepped forward to deliver a warning that would change both our fates. I was weak, I was defective, and I was poor, but for the first time in my life, I was determined to be a man.